Hey, what's up everybody? It's Lids and we're back for some more Gwent, and today we're going to talk about new cards from the Tide Rises Gwent expansion coming out July 11th. There will be 36 new cards, including 6 from each faction, no new neutrals, and today we're focusing on the monsters reveals. We'll start off with the CYCLOPS Warrior, which is a 4 base power, 4 provision, Ogroid Warrior, and it looks like Ogroids will be the focus of this expansion for monsters. And Ogroids in the past haven't really had much of an identity for monsters outside of having generally high base power and not a lot else. But the deal here is, after 5 turns, the CYCLOPS Warrior will set its power to 10, which for a 4 provision card is fantastic value. That is a long time to wait though. However, on deploy, you'll reduce that timer by 1 for each Ogroid in your hand. So that means if you have at least 4 Ogroids in your hand by the time your turn ends, this will be at 10 base power, which is amazing. So if you have a dedicated Ogroid deck, then you play this early and it's amazing tempo. So that's pretty awesome. Then we have the Ogre Warrior, which is a 6 base power, 6 provision Ogroid Warrior. On deploy, boost self by 2 for each allied unit with 10 or more power. And as I was just saying, Ogroids, to the extent that they have an identity at this point, generally have high base power, and that's pretty much all there is to them. So that should make it fairly easy to get 10 or more power on a bunch of units. So this is more of a finisher, of course. And you'd probably need to get at least 2 cards with 10 or more power for this to feel worthwhile. That way it's at least a 10 for 6, which is decent value. But in the long round, this could turn into something much bigger than that. So that is one thing that, because Ogroids were usually just high base power and not really engine oriented, they struggled a bit in long rounds because they didn't have much long-term potential. Short rounds, they were great, but this Ogre Warrior could help change that a bit. If you do get stuck with this in a short round though, then this won't be very good. But at least worst case, it's still a 6. Then we have Girdle of Giant Strength, which actually, this, as well as I think both of the other cards that we just saw, were also using art from Rogue Mage, so that's cool to see those making their way into multiplayer Gwent. But the deal here, first of all, it's a special card that costs 12 provisions, so this better be good. Boost an allied unit by 10, which is a lot, but for 12 provisions, that's still not good value. Then Might, which is a new keyword, we'll talk about that in just a second. When you play an Ogroid, play self from your graveyard and gain Doomed. So basically, you get 10 points, and then hopefully when you play your next Ogroid, or some Ogroid in the future, you're getting another 10-point boost, at which point it's 20 points for 12 provisions, and that feels a lot better. But what is Might? Might is, trigger this ability if you control a unit with 10 or more power on each of your rows. So 10 points, again, is an important threshold here for monsters. Reminds me a little bit of Sabbath. Sabbath, of course, being 25 power in one row, but in this case, you have a smaller number to reach, just 10, but you need it in 2 different rows. So probably going to take you at least 2 turns to do that. I mean, that's still pretty quick setup in that case if you do get a couple of big point slams, and maybe with a couple of CYCLOPS Warriors, you can make that happen in just 2 turns fairly reliably. But if we go back to the Girdle of Giant Strength, basically that means if you have decent value in 2 separate rows, maybe you can, on your very next turn, reactivate the second round of Girdle's Giant Strength and get that 20 points for 12 provisions, and that's decent value. Or you could play this at the end of, say, round 1 or round 2, and as long as your opponent doesn't do something like play Xavier or Squirrel, if the Girdle of Giant Strength remains in your graveyard, you could actually get 10 points of carryover with this Girdle of Giant Strength. Be a little bit careful with that though, because if you don't have time for that second boost, then you might get stuck getting not so great value out of a card that you invested a fair number of provisions into. Let's move on now to Lord RIPTIDE, which is one of the new epic cards. It is an Ogroid Warrior, 10 base power, 8 provisions, and then if you play it in the melee row, it will clash with the highest power enemy unit. Clash being a keyword that they used a little while back to formalize the effect that Chad has, as well as a few other cards, mostly Skellige. So basically, Lord RIPTIDE will damage himself by the power of whatever your opponent's unit's power is, and Lord RIPTIDE will damage that unit by Lord RIPTIDE's power. That means that technically speaking, the ability at least is a net 0-point play. Of course, you might end up destroying an engine, in which case you're reducing some of your opponent's long-term potential. But the key thing here is when you have Might at the end of your turn, when Lord RIPTIDE is in your hand, he will gain 2 armor. So basically, you want to get that Might as quickly as possible, again, meaning 10 power in both of your rows, and then hold on to Lord RIPTIDE in hand for a while, build up that armor, and that way, when you do play him in the melee row, he'll clash, but the damage that he takes, he'll just absorb with that armor, so might still have the the full 10 power or close to it. Meanwhile, you do get 10 damage on your opponent's biggest unit, which is obviously a pretty big deal. So this is another one of those things that to deal with one of what was previously Ogroid's biggest weaknesses, if you could even say that Ogroids was an archetype before, in that they had that short rounds tempo, but didn't really have a lot going on long term because they didn't have any engines and didn't really have any big finishers besides just base power with things like Old Spear Tip. So that's where Lord Riptide could certainly help in long rounds where you at least have a chance going against some engine-oriented decks. Now let's go for Tugo the Elder, which is one of the new legendary cards. It's 9 base power and 11 provisions, Ogroid and a Druid. At the end of your turn, boost the lowest power unit you control by 1. Now that doesn't sound great because sure, you're getting 9 points for 11 provisions, which is still not great value short term, and you get a 1 point per turn engine, which still feels pretty lackluster, certainly at least by today's Gwent standards. However, if you do have Might, you'll boost all of your lowest power units you control by 1 instead. So hard to gauge exactly how valuable that's going to be, but basically that means you want to have a bunch of low power units that are tied for the same amount of power. That way, rather than just getting 1 boost per turn, you're getting 2 or 3 boosts per turn, maybe even more than that. But it's hard to gauge just how many points that's going to be because it's hard to know what exact cards we're going to see people running in their Ogroid-centric decks. Presumably, you're going to want to have as many Ogroids as you can get because we have already seen some cards that benefit from having as many Ogroids as you can add, and that trend is going to continue. So why don't we take a look at the final legendary monsters card for the new expansion, King CHRUM? Probably CHRUM. Ogroid Warrior, 1 base power, 14 provisions, so incredibly expensive. However, if you have Might, you will gain Resilience, which on a 1 power unit might not sound like much. However, the base power of this card is actually going to be set to the number of Ogroids in your starting deck, and that is where we really start to see that the more Ogroids, the better. You want to have just about as many as you can possibly get, because we can take a look into the deck builder for just a second here. How many Ogroids is that realistically going to be? You must be asking yourself. Well, we have what? A couple of Ogroids we can have here. That's 2. We have 2 Ogre Warriors. That's 4. Girdle Giant Strength is not an Ogroid. Then Lord Riptide, you're a gold, so you can only have one of these. So that's 5, 6, 7 on King CHRUM. So assuming you're using at least all the new cards, that's at least a 7-point resilience unit. That's better than most resilience units, but it's still not amazing. Still not worth that 14 provision cost, you wouldn't think. So let's take a look at some of the other Ogroids that currently exist. And this is where we'll start to see some of those things that I was alluding to before, where these cards don't really have a cohesive archetype that they build around, which makes it hard to put multiple of them in the same deck. I mean, you do have things like Cave Troll, which is always a solid option. So that's one you could add pretty safely. So that's, 8 Ogroids, Old Spear Tip, and Old Spear Tip Asleep. Maybe you throw those in, that gives you a couple more. And then we have, I'm wondering if maybe Necker could be worth including, because to the extent that there was an Ogroid archetype before, you could maybe make the case that it was play Thrive units like Necker and Fuka early, bunch of low base power stuff that benefits from playing high base power things to trigger your Thrive, like the Old Spear Tips of the world. So if you get a few of these on the board, then of course this is 2 cards you're playing per turn, and that could be a good way to set up for Tugo. But either that, or maybe you just spam things like CYCLOPS Warrior and you try to line a whole bunch of things up at exactly 10 power. Unfortunately, Tugo is at 9 power, which I'm sure is not a coincidence, although I guess maybe if you have a bunch of these 10 base power CYCLOPS Warriors on your first turn, Tugo might end up boosting itself, but then this is tied on 10 with the other CYCLOPS Warriors, and then you're getting 3 points per turn on Tugo, then maybe that starts to pay off. But with those other Ogroids you're adding, you can probably get King CHRUM to about 10 points fairly easily, I would think. Potentially a little bit more than that, but of course there's always the question of, how much are you willing to sacrifice adding some cards that are maybe suboptimal when you have to play them, but do help set up bigger cards like King CHRUM. We've seen a lot of those instances with some of the strongest cards we've seen in previous expansions and reworks. So some questions there, but then there are also, I believe, a couple of additional balance changes to existing Ogroids that are probably worth noting here, because those are cards you may want to add into those Ogroid decks. Those being, Jotun is changing completely. This is going to turn into a 1 base power, 8 provision card. On deploy, boost self by the total base power of Ice Giants in your starting deck. The Ice Giants are these 7 base power, 5 provision guys, and Ogroids. This is sort of a classic example. High base power, so good tempo, but no abilities at all. But if you have 2 of these in your deck, then that's a total of 14 base power. So if Jotun is getting boosted by the total base power of all the Ice Giants in your starting deck, have 2 Ice Giants. That's 14 base power. This guy starts at 1, gets boosted by 14. He becomes a 15 for 8, because this is turning into an 8 provision card. That's a lot of tempo. So that certainly looks like that'd be a strong inclusion. And then, good example of, Ice Giant, were you going to include it in your deck? Maybe, maybe not. But if you're loading up on the Ogroids for King CHRUM and you want to set up Jotun, then that is probably a sacrifice that you'd want to make. Then Ice Troll is also changing. This is going to turn into a 5 base power, 2 armor, 4 provision unit with Might. At the end of your turn, boost self by 1. So one of the few engines that Ogroids would have in this case, unless you're going to include Neckers, and you might end up including them in these types of lists, but it's still 5 base power, so it's certainly starting off bigger than the Neckers would be, although since you have to have 10 power in each row to activate that Might ability, can't really play this on turn 1. Will have to be a mid-round engine in most circumstances. So it'll be interesting to see how that all plays out then. Of course, there are still other high-tempo point slams like Goliath, Pugo, and things like that, but how is all this stuff going to piece together? Because it certainly does still seem like it is primarily about the big high-tempo point slam Ogroids, but there are a few engines mixed in there as well. So still seems like short rounds are going to be the specialty. Long rounds, you probably will still get outpaced by some more engine-oriented decks, especially because you might not have that much control. And then if you are looking to fill in a couple of additional slots in your deck for non-Ogroids, the thing that catches my attention here might be to go the Relic route, because there are some things that seem like they could synergize relatively well. You probably don't want to play stuff that requires that you play additional relics, because most of your cards are still going to be Ogroids, so probably not Ratcatcher-esque, but reaching Sabbath should be fairly easy if you're already trying to get to Might. Yes, you're going to have at least 10 points in both rows, but it's not going to be that difficult to go a little bit further in one of those rows, get up to 25 to reach the Sabbath threshold. So things like maybe Bloody Mistress, although might not be able to afford this kind of provision investment. Who knows? Reminds me a lot of King CHRUM. I think there's going to be a lot of similarities there, and you could maybe even consider swapping one out for the other. But in particular, I think the Witch Apprentice, because you're going to have a lot of tempo with your Ogroids, so it should be fairly easy to get up to Sabbath relatively quickly, which is what you really want with the Witch Apprentice. And that way you have one of the engines that otherwise you might be missing with a Ogroid-centric deck. And then maybe you could throw in a Fiend as another option for early round plays. Doesn't cost many provisions, so worst comes to worst, you just never play it. So there's a look at the new Monsters Ogroid cards for the Tide Rises expansion coming out July 11th. It's nice to see monsters go back to their classic point slammy ways, which should also make this an easy archetype for new players to try. Let me know in the comments what you think of the new cards. What combos are you going to try to pull off? Will you play pure Ogroids, or will you combine them in a hybrid relic deck? And will you go pure point slam to get Might as quickly and easily as possible, or will you sneak in some engines as well? Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you next time.